Good evening, everybody. Thank you for those who are here in person and all the people out in Zoom land. Just for the people here, reminder, please have your telephone on silent. That'll be good. For those who don't know me, there's probably not many, I'm Warwick Henry, the President of the Queensland branch of HSA. Peter Dunn, our very efficient secretary, will be handling the Zoom equipment and running the camera and mics, etc. Welcome local members. Somebody who's with us tonight has been around for a long time, John Godfrey. Welcome along, John. He was never a long time ago and coming back. That's good. Just a bit of news, or all this talk is, for those who haven't heard about it, it's going to be the big Pacific Air Show on the Gold Coast in August, Friday the 18th to Sunday the 20th. It's going to be, all the air show will be going up and down the water just off the beach. And there are seats available for some areas. I noticed that the seats, entry seats are $500. I don't know how much difference it makes of being in a grandstand watching the aircraft going back and forth or standing along the beach. I dare say there'll be more information about that to come. And I hope they have a good air show. It'll be a full-on thing run by professional air show people. For the local members, we're considering having an outing to RAF Handley Aviation Heritage Centre and probably Queensland Air Museum as well. I'll shortly be sending a message to all our local members, asking them points about whether we make it on a Tuesday or a Thursday or a Sunday. I think the vote's going to be for Tuesday or Thursday. And we'll keep you informed with that. One thing about the Heritage Centre out there at Handley, they've got a new exhibition getting going, which is about the Korean War. And it's expected to be opening at about the 27th of July, which was the date of the armistice, the 70th anniversary of the armistice in Korea. Of course, you'll hear about it. Tonight, we've got our guest speaker is Ian Campbell. Right, and I'll introduce him closely shortly. Just the next several meetings. Next month, we'll have Daryl Purdom, who was here with us, telling a story about a Vector bomber falling 30,000 feet. An interesting one. In July, Peter Doherty, okay, on the air and in the air, media aviation in Brisbane. And for August, Dennis Baker, we're talking about the Barra Sono Boy. In September, Tony Arbon, the editor of Model Aviation magazines and books, and his story will be about the history and development of Australian air data from a manual records to the website. Remember, everybody at home and out there in Zoomland, if you've got a good tale to tell about aviation, please get in touch with us. We always need new members or new people to talk. And however, Ian Campbell, if you'd like to come up. He's going to talk, his subject tonight, as you probably all know, is about aircraft flown by Air Vice Marshal Don Bennett, CB, CBE, DSO, from July 1930 to September 39. You notice those letters? Most of you probably know these, but some people don't know all of them. CB, Companion of the Most Honourable Order of the Bath, is CBE, which is Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. You've got a DSO, Distinguished Service Order, and he's also an FRAES, Fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. That was Don Bennett. However, I'll pass the microphone over to you, Ian. Put on your shirt into the mic. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Warwick, and good evening, everybody. In June next year, the Queensland Air Museum will turn 50. And by any measure, this is a remarkable achievement. It was actually the brainchild of a group of AHSA Queensland members who provided initiative, energy, commitment, determination, and not a few dollars to see their dream realised. And in 2023, this year, QAM has a collection not just of national, but of international significance. Now, of that group, I've had the pleasure of knowing Ron Cuskelly for some time now. And I've also met Bob Livingston on a previous visit here, and I know he's online tonight. Now there may be others of you in the room, online, or will watch this presentation later who are part of that group, and I want to acknowledge you as well. Warwick is included in that. I'm sorry, Warwick, I pick you up there. All of us who now make our own contribution to QAM stand on the shoulders of these giants, and we owe them a great debt of gratitude and the highest respect. And it is not lost on me that without them, I would not be at work on the Don Bennett Alan Vial collection at QAM, nor even standing here tonight. And I also owe a great debt of gratitude to Alan Vial, who is the late president of the Pathfinder Force Association of Queensland, who with the same level of drive amassed the archive I now work on. And a key part of that archive relates to a certain Air Vice Marshal Don Bennett, about whom I'm writing a new biography. Now, Bennett flew many aircraft, so tonight I'm focusing on just 14 of his first 10 years in aviation from 1933 to 1940. Now, this is not going to be a technical presentation on those aircraft. I'm just using these aircraft as a means of showcasing his early career, and it's going to be broad brush and quick. But if you want technical detail, at the end of this presentation, I'm going to offer you a list of the aircraft that he flew in the first 10 years. And you can go away and do your own research on those aircraft if you wish. So let's begin. And like Bennett, I'm going to go fast and as efficiently as I can. So see if you can keep up, and there will be questions at the end. Don Bennett arrived at Point Cook in mid-July 1930, and due to the depression and the limited number of spots for pilots in the RAAF, he was offered a short service commission, whereupon gaining his wings in 31, he would head to the RAF in England for 4 years. The aircraft in which he learnt the basics was the de Havilland DH-60X Cirrus Moth, the one that preceded the DH-60G. And I've included the serials of the moths that he flew at Point Cook for those who like such details. There were some highlights. He took his first flight on the 28th of July 1930, and his test for solo was handled by a certain Flight Lieutenant Fred Sherger, who was the chief flying instructor at that point, and he would become the first Air Chief Marshal in the RAAF, followed by the Chief of the Air Staff from 1957 to 61, and then Chairman of the Chiefs of Staff, now known as CDF, from 61 to 66. Fred Sherger also lectured them on air fighting, though he himself hadn't experienced aerial combat. After 50 hours, including 31 solo, Don was rated above average in the Moth, which in my view is that he showed early promise as a pilot. He progressed to the Westland Wapiti with the 480 horsepower Bristol Jupiter engine. And there were some highlights. The very first flight he took in this aircraft was Vickers gun practice. Now, they had lectures on Vickers guns at Point Cook, all about how to unjam these when they were jamming in flight. They didn't actually learn anything else except how to unjam them, which came in use when he was in England. When bombing on land targets, of which he had some practice, the RAF advised locals to, quote, leave their doors and windows open and remove fragile items from their shelves. One of the other things that he did in the Wapiti was photography, and this was principally about equipping pilots and observers to be good at reconnaissance, because in war it was supposed that the Air Force would be working for either the Army or the Navy, and they would then go and create and analyse these mosaics, which are these overlapping photos that were done to produce trench maps in World War I. After 102 hours of flying time, he got his wings around about the 12th of June 1931, and he became second overall in the course, which miffed him greatly. There was one other fellow who beat him, and we shall not give his name here, but he did exult in the fact that he became first in flying. In August, after spending some time back in Brisbane, he headed for England to begin life as a fighter boy. On arrival in England, he was dispatched to 29 Fighter Squadron at RAF North Weald on the northern outskirts of London, flying the Armstrong Whitworth Siskin Mark IIIA. And he said it was undoubtedly one of the worst aeroplanes ever built. Most models of the Siskin, he said, were not stable in any plane. But what he did say was that if you learnt to fly the thing, you learnt an awful lot about flying. Although there were numbers of his contemporaries who managed to crash them, and one fellow managed to crash more than one. There were 6 training priorities there at the time: radio telegraphy, gunnery, formation flying, aerobatics, night flying, and navigation. Now, interestingly, radio telegraphy was the one that was given priority. The RAF was only just then fitting helmets with telephone receivers, commencing air-to-ground voice comms, which on occasion Bennett achieved at a grand distance of 43 miles. On another occasion, on one occasion, they managed air-to-air communications between aircraft. He notes a battle flight climb where they achieved 16,000 feet in 14.5 minutes. And it was at North Weald that he had his first crash. Now, he went on an unauthorised pinpoint exercise to the south of London, and he went with a fellow called Flying Officer Widows, unfortunate name for this particular episode. They hit a storm front which hadn't been forecast on the return journey, and because they didn't have enough petrol, they actually had to fly through it. As a result, the carburetors iced up, and he himself descended rapidly through the clouds, ended up, cleared a small grove of trees, hit the ground, flipped it, and ended up on its back with his head 6 inches from the ground, which led to a formal inquiry. There were also annual live firing exercises at RAF Sutton Bridge over near the Wash, and I can actually report to you what his success rate was on gunnery. So in aiming at ground targets, Don Bennett had a 25% hit rate, but when it came to actually shooting at the aerial drogue, his hit rate was 5.2%. And the only thing that I can conclude from that is that as an air gunner, he made a very good pilot. After he had finished at North Weald, he went off to do the flying boats pilots course at the School of Naval Cooperation and Aerial Navigation at RAF Calshot. He was recommended to do this by a mate of his, Ralph Cleland, and they were flying the Supermarine Southampton Mark IIs with a crew of 4, pilot, navigator / WOP, and 2 gunners. And it's a good point to note here that Arthur Harris did the flying boat pilots course immediately after Don Bennett. So Don Bennett did number 15 and Arthur Harris did number 16, but as a wing commander. They he progressed to 210 Flying Boat Squadron at Pembroke Dock in Wales. And he was there for 3 months when Harris arrived there as the commanding officer. And Harris's mission was to push the flying boat fraternity to fly at night. And Don was one of the first to do that. And as a result, Harris described him as the most efficient airman he had ever met. And this has become the most famous and most oft-repeated depiction or statement about Don Bennett. In June 1933, he became part of the Air Defence Experimental Establishment, which ran trials of these huge parabolic domes that were set up all the way along the English Channel with a view to be able to pick up the noise of aircraft coming across the channel. And so in June, for several weeks at night time in the Southampton, Don flew back and forth and back and forth and back and forth along the channel at night time to see if these things could actually pick him up. They were unreliable because they found it difficult to distinguish between ships and planes. Planes themselves were starting to get faster and faster, so they were coming across the channel much faster than these things could pick them up, and it was rapidly overtaken by radar anyway. He was having a good time at 210 Squadron when he was quite suddenly moved back to RAF Calshot for a second stint and made a lecturer there, only 9 months after he had completed the flying boat pilot's course, and he was to lecture in navigation. And he combined that with being a seaplane training instructor who now himself took the flying boat pilot's courses, of which he did many in his time over the next 2 years. He found lecturing anathema. He hated it. But what it did teach him were what the gaps were in the air navigation syllabus, which would lead him within a couple of years to actually write a textbook on the subject. From about January 1934, he started to think about the fact that in August of the following year, his 4 years on the Short Service Commission was going to come to an end, and he was getting a little tired with the RAF. It was not going at the pace that he wanted it to go at, and he decided that he wanted to move towards civil aviation, even though he had 18 months still to go. And so he decided that to achieve that, he would go and do his first class air navigator's license. And that was a civil, not a military license, of which very few had been issued at that time in the world. While at Calshot, he bought his first private aircraft, a DH-53 Hummingbird, for which he paid the grand sum of £115. The original had a 26 horsepower Tom Tit engine, but that was found to be quite inadequate. So de Havilland actually put in 2 other engines into the plane, of which Don had one, which was the 32 horsepower Bristol Cherub 3. Don's first comment about this aircraft was it had a stall like the crack of a whip. Its reputation was that it was underpowered, impractical, and unreliable. If you managed to start it, it stopped fairly quickly soon afterwards, unless you managed to master how the whole thing worked. And as a result, only 15 were built. At de Havilland, it produced the very strongest feelings of no enthusiasm. When you started it up, the vibrations actually made the dials unreadable. Now, I've actually included on this slide a photo of a model of Bennett's Hummingbird by a fellow called Carmel John Attard. Now, he's based in Malta, and when I was looking online for this particular aircraft, I saw a photo of this particular aircraft and an email address, and I emailed him, and he was extremely helpful to me over the course of putting together the information for the biography of Bennett on this particular aircraft. An extraordinary gentleman, engineer from England, who retired to Malta and has spent his time in retirement amassing an aviation collection and building model aircraft, of which he has hundreds. Extraordinary gentleman. As indicated earlier, Don decided in 1934 that at the end of his RAF Short Service Commission, he would pursue civil aviation. So while on leave from RAF Calshot, he got a gig as a pilot with Jersey Airways flying the de Havilland DH-84 Dragon. It was a local airline, only started 6 months previously, and they configured their plane for 8 passengers only. They flew local routes between Jersey, Portsmouth, Southampton, and Heston. He, of course, was extremely experienced flying and backwards and forwards in the Channel, so he was a good candidate to choose for pilot for one of these aircraft. It was a full-on introduction to civil aviation, and he absolutely loved it. The pilots did everything: pilot, air steward, luggage, and all the associated paperwork. Interestingly, on Jersey itself, although all the other aerodromes had runways, at Jersey, at St Albans, they actually landed on the beach. Now, the thing about this particular beach was that it had a 9 to 12 metre tide, which rose at 3 inches a minute. Now, they never lost a plane, but they did lose the bus. One day the bus went under, which made it just a little difficult to convey passengers from St Albans down to the beach for them to get on the plane. Now, Jersey's Airways timetables and flight times were quite frequently disrupted by the weather in the Channel, but as you might imagine, the tides didn't wait for the timetables. So quite often they had quite hair-raising experiences coming in here, and Don himself records coming in at one stage to a very narrow landing strip in a strong crosswind. The gig came to an abrupt end, unfortunately, when a local politician said that they'd discovered that an RAF pilot was pinching the job of a local civil pilot. And he was actually then sent back to Calshot, which he was due to do anyway. So in January 1934, Don decided he wanted to fly in the Centenary air race of October 34, and he would get his chance in the Lockheed Vega DL-1A, which was a one-off version of the DL-1 with a Pratt & Whitney 450 horsepower Wasp engine and an all-metal fuselage. Its previous owner was one Glenn Kidston, who actually set records in it, but he was killed in April 1933 in a puss moth in South Africa. And the Vega was put on the market. It was actually hanging at Handworth for a year before it was purchased by one Horry Miller of McRobertson Miller Airways. And he was actually originally going to be the race partner of Jimmy Woods of Western Australian Airways, but he had to pull out. Now, very late in the piece, when Jimmy Woods was in England and getting ready for the race, he discovered that Don Bennett was wanting to be in the race and actually extended the invitation to him. But Don was a bit miffed again that at this point he was only going to be the navigator on the aircraft. There were several highlights of this particular flight. On the 19th, which was the day before they took off quite early in the morning, thousands of people gathered at Mildenhall, which was where it took off from, including the King, the Queen, and the Prince of Wales. And the Prince of Wales himself actually came up to the Vega and spoke to Jimmy and Don and got some idea as to what they were intending to do, namely to win. It was the first use of his first-class air navigator's licence. Now, unfortunately, the aircraft didn't last terribly long. From the time that Don had arrived at Handworth to look at the state the aircraft was in, it had been hanged for a year, and it was not in terribly good condition. And Jimmy Woods didn't have an awful lot of money to get things fixed, and he was working on a shoestring budget. And they had discovered there was a problem with the port radius strut, and they'd made an attempt to fix it, but it had seized once after they'd fixed it, and it wasn't looking terribly good. But they took off on the morning of the 20th anyway, and they made it all the way across the Mediterranean to Aleppo in Syria. Now, as they came into land, the port radius strut broke, the plane went over on its back, and Bennett, who at the time had positioned himself right at the back of the aircraft, was shot forward from the back of the aircraft to the front and suffered 3 crushed vertebrae. He himself had got out by the time that Jimmy Woods came to as the pilot, and he had actually hit his head on the dash and was bleeding everywhere, and Don was on the outside of the airplane rapping on, saying, "Are you okay, Jimmy?" Managed to get him out. Within 2 weeks, Don was back at Calshot flying his favourite Southampton S1234. At the end of his short service commission in August 35, he married Lee Gubler from Switzerland, and they started their honeymoon in Switzerland before coming back to England and catching the ship to Australia. Now, in coming to Australia, it wasn't just simply to introduce Lee to the family here in Brisbane. He came to have an interview with New England Airways, flying the Avro 61810. This aircraft, VH-UPI, is the one that he flew. And they flew between Brisbane and Sydney via Lismore. Now, NEA was about to become Airlines of Australia Limited, aiming to expand routes from Melbourne all the way through to Cairns. And the highlight was that he was offered the position of navigation superintendent. Now, unfortunately for New England Airways, who were very keen to obtain his services, he had come with an offer in his pocket from Imperial Airways, who were going to offer him a position flying flying boats on international routes. So you can imagine flying the east coast, or potentially flying the east coast of Australia with a limited number of aircraft versus flying international routes. He had outgrown Australia, and by the end of his honeymoon, he'd made the decision and he was on the boat back to England. Now, I often have people talk to me about his book, The Complete Air Navigator, which many people will say is unintelligible for most, or intelligible mostly for Don Bennett. Now, it is absolutely true, because we have the notes that he made in writing that book, that he wrote the first chapter on the ship out from England to Australia on his honeymoon, because clearly there wasn't much else to do on board ship. And in Australia, of course, he was busy with family and all the rest of it, New England Airways. But because he was going to be busy taking up his spot piloting with Imperial Airways on return to England in the beginning of 36, he wrote the rest of the textbook with Lee as his amanuensis on the ship on the way back to England. On arrival back, he sent it off to Pitman, and it was published several months later. On joining Imperial Airways in 36, he commenced flying the Handley Page HP-42 on the continental routes before being posted to Imperial's hub at Alexandria to commence on the flying boats. Now, the HP-42 was Imperial's land-based flagship. It had a cruising speed of a leisurely 87 knots. And its cruising altitude I sum up as not very high. But the great thing about this was that it spawned a thing called incidental tourism, which was showing the sights from on high. It was very expensive to fly as a passenger as one of these aircraft. So they made the most of between here and here and between here and here, including they would produce these postcards, as you can see, which is the Heracles flying over from heading south from the base in Alex, heading south to Kisumu and Lake Victoria in Kenya. The routes that they flew, the European routes, Don had a go at some of these before he was sent off to Alex. They would fly from London over to Paris and to Rome, Marseille, Cologne and Brussels, all those Western airports. But later, when he was not on flying boats, he flew the two routes, the two Empire routes that came out of Alex, the southern route, which took them down the Nile and through Central Africa to Kisumu on Lake Victoria. And on the eastern route, this was a very exotic route, flying through to Karachi, which was then in India. They would fly through stops in Gaza, Baghdad, down the Euphrates to Basra, off to Kuwait, Bahrain, Sharjah, modern-day Dubai, and then across to Gwadar and on to Karachi. You could imagine just how excited he was in flying that. And they would do that over a period of 3 days. At Alex, Don's first gig was on the Short Brothers S8 Calcutta. It had 3 Bristol Jupiter 9F engines of 540 horsepower each, a cruising speed of 84 knots. Now, that was problematic in poor weather, which was quite frequent in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was configured for up to 15 passengers, but it mostly carried mail and freight. And the routes was a single route. They flew back and forth between Alex in Egypt and Brindisi, which was on the heel of Italy, stopping at Mirabella Harbour in Crete and at Athens. Now, the typical schedule, leaving Athens, Alex to Mirabella would be 4 hours with a 30-minute stopover. Mirabella to Athens would be 2 hours and 20 and another 30-minute stopover. And then Athens on the final leg to Brindisi would be 4 hours. So to fly that short distance between Alex and Brindisi in Italy was 11 hours and 20 minutes. At a minimum, depending upon the weather. There were some highlights. It was Don's first time as a civil airlines pilot flying boats. They had to confront Mediterranean weather in an open cockpit. And one of the biggest highlights of the Calcutta was upgrading to the Kent. The Short Brothers S17, Kent was only a marginally better performer than the Calcutta, despite its extra engine. So it flew at 91 knots, with the 4 Bristol Jupiter XFBM engines of 555 horsepower. And it was already at Alex when Don arrived, and he would alternate between them depending upon which was available at the time. The Kent was designed to carry more freight than the Calcutta rather than more passengers. The route was exactly the same and undertaken in about the same amount of time. Scipio was actually Don's favourite aircraft, and he has a painting of this. So we had a painting of this framed, which we have in the Don Bennett office at the Queensland Air Museum. But unfortunately, his mate Arthur Wilcoxon crashed it in the harbour at Mirabella, killing a number of people, which left them with only one, which was Satyrus. But like the Calcutta, the thing that he enjoyed most was upgrading to the Empire flying boat. In October 36, the first Short Brothers S-23 C-Class Empire arrived at Alex, and that enabled them to extend flying boats across the Empire routes. So now what we would see is they would fly the entire distance from Alexandria to Southampton in England. On the southern route, they extended from Kisumu on Lake Victoria all the way through to Durban in South Africa, and they flew that entire route. And they also now were able to go from Alex all the way through the eastern route through to Singapore. There were some highlights for Don. The first is that he was the first to ever fly from Egypt to UK in one day. On the 22nd of May in 1937, an S-23 arrived late from Australia. And so he determined, because it was full of Australians, that he would actually get them back on schedule. So he left very early in the morning from Alex on the 23rd. And in one go, he flew all the way through to Southampton, through Athens, Brindisi, Rome, and Marseille. It took them 15 hours at an average speed of 153 miles per hour, and it was a record. Secondly, he only ever flew once all the way through to Singapore, but it was quite an eventful trip. He allegedly flew under the Willingdon Bridge at Calcutta on takeoff, and I want to return to that because it's quite an extraordinary story about him. And on that same trip, as he was coming back to England, he evacuated the staff from Imperial's flying boat base outside Rome the day before Mussolini declared war. And it was, to that point, the last scheduled flight by Imperial across the Mediterranean, with the war having broken out. Now, I want to come back to this Willingdon Bridge incident. Now, I did a lot of work on this particular story about Bennett because it goes to an issue of myth-making. Now, I've read a fair bit about Don Bennett in my time, and one of the things that I struggle with is that the stories get repeated, and then they get repeated and repeated by other people, picked up and repeated by others, but they're not sourced. And there are, in fact, 2 references by authors to this particular episode, but neither of them sources where this story came from. So I just wanted to look at what were the possibilities that this actually happened, because really, there are some people that want to make out that Don had superhuman flying abilities, but maybe there were limits. So let's have a look. The S-23 tail from waterline through to the top was 7.85 metres, which gave you, if you were going to go under the Willingdon Bridge, which you can see top right there, would give you a 1 metre clearance at high tide and a 6 metre clearance at low tide if you were on the water under the bridge on takeoff. Now, the thing to understand is that he was going this direction. He was going from right to left underneath the bridge, and the bridge itself, the river itself took a right-hand turn once you came under the bridge. So that in itself made this unlikely. Now, the other thing to note is that this was monsoon season and he was going against the current. Now, in monsoon season on this river, the water comes down very rapidly the other direction, carrying an awful lot of debris. Now, one of the things we know about the S-23 was that if it hit debris, and numbers of them did, it actually damaged considerably the planing hull, for some of the aircraft catastrophically. So the whole idea of going from right to left, taking off underneath the bridge with that form of clearance, with a turn in the river, against the monsoon water coming down, carrying debris, I don't know. What I do know is that I could not prove it did not happen. Outside of his time as the Air Officer commanding of the Pathfinder Force, it's probably Don's exploits in Mercury that have contributed most to his fame. It had a crew of 2, pilot and radio operator / second pilot. Originally fitted with Rapier 5 engines, they were upgraded for his Atlantic record flight to the 6s. It was not designed to carry passengers, but freight mail only. And it was originally configured for 1,200 gallons, carrying a 1,000-pound payload over a range of 3,800 miles in still air, which, if you could achieve still air in the North Atlantic, would take you from Foynes on the west coast of Ireland all the way through to New York non-stop. The great limitation of the Mercury was that it could not take off on its own with a full fuel load. And I want to highlight 3 record flights that he made in 1938. The first of these on the 20th of July is he flew across the Atlantic, and he achieved 3 world records on that flight alone. It was the first commercial payload across the Atlantic. He carried newspapers, mail, and newsreels weighing 900 pounds. It was the first east to west crossing from the UK to Montreal non-stop. And it was the fastest east to west crossing of 13 hours and 29 minutes from Foynes in Ireland to Cape Bald in Newfoundland. Then the very famous flight, which was his long-distance seaplane record from the 6th to the 8th of October. He flew from Dundee in Scotland to Orange River in South Africa in 42 hours and 26 minutes, flying a fair bit of that time himself because his co-pilot was having hallucinations from a range of things. They were having to hand pump at one stage the fuel from the floats into the overwing air tank because the electric pumps failed, and they were also in considerable turbulence for a period of time doing that. It set a world record, which still stands, of 5,208 nautical miles certified by the Federation of Aeronautics International, a French body. And then finally, towards the end of that year, he was the very first person to fly from the UK to Alexandria non-stop on the 29th of November. He carried 2,180 pounds, that's nearly 1 tonne of Christmas mail, which he did in 14 hours and 40 minutes. After Mercury, Don took a lead role in bringing the S-30 into service. Now, this was an upgraded, strengthened version of the S-23, some of which were modified for in-flight refuelling for doing the first scheduled commercial service across the North Atlantic. And Imperial was working with Sir Alan Cobham's Flight Refuelling Limited Company, flying these HP Harrows. And on the 30th of July, you see a photo there, Don did a public display of in-flight refuelling in the S-30 Cabot. He was also one of 2 pilots who inaugurated the first scheduled commercial transatlantic flight by Imperial in the S-30s. And for this, he carried 2 grouse dead for President and Mrs. Roosevelt as a present from Imperial Airways. They had been shot on Helmsley Moor that morning, flown down to London, put on the train, taken down to Southampton and put on the aircraft for flying across. There were some things that I won't go into that made it a little difficult to deliver these grouse to President and Eleanor Roosevelt on time. So by the time they actually hit the table, presidential table. We're not too sure what condition the grouse were in. And the president and his wife never said. But I'm sure that it was well received nonetheless. On the 3rd of September, the very day that Britain declared war on Germany, Don was flying a scheduled trip in the S-30 Caribou west over the Atlantic when he took a distress call from the SS Athenia, which had just been torpedoed by the U-boat U-30. And he actually thought that he might go and help out, but he realised that it would be a risk to the aircraft and also to his passengers. So he immediately got his wireless operator to forward that distress message on to others, and that then saw the vast majority of passengers on that particular liner rescued. And then if you skip nearly a year through to June 1940, Don actually flew the Polish Commander-in-Chief and Prime Minister, General Sikorsky, from London down to Lake Biscarrosse near Bordeaux on a highly secret mission to rescue the Polish General Staff. And he flew them back on the 21st of June, and then the following day, France capitulated at Compiègne, and the war for France was over. So it was a very, very finely tuned rescue mission. Many, if not most, of those who were at Imperial didn't know that he actually undertook that mission. And I just want to say a very big thanks to Paul Sheehan of AHSA in Victoria, who is a thorough expert in all things to do with Imperial Airways and has been a considerable support to me in my research efforts in writing the chapters, as I have done, of the biography on Bennett during his time at Imperial Airways. Paul, you're a legend. And now to the big finish. The presentation covered only 14 aircraft, and I now want to list for you the aircraft that Don Bennett flew during those first 10 years of his aviation career. And these now appear one at a time on the screen automatically, and you can have the list if you want to go and do your own research. So I invite you to sit back and take them in. Quite something, isn't it? I have started researching, obviously, his period from 40 to 45. We can add another 27 to that. We won't put those up tonight. I want to finish with one final slide. It's an aircraft that Don flew here at Archerfield. And it may or may not be on this list. And I don't know the answer to this question, so I'm putting it out there. When he got his wings at Point Cook, he returned to Brisbane before catching the ship to England to start his short service commission. And on the 23rd of June, 1931, he came out to Archerfield, and at 7 o'clock, Lester Brain of Qantas gave him a 5-minute test, which was the shortest flying test of his career. And at that point, he started a series of joy rides for 10 people who'd accompanied him to the airport so they could show off his flying skills. And for the next 90 minutes, he gave them joy rides. Now, he does not identify this aircraft. He simply notes that it was a machine that was owned by Qantas Limited. I would like to know, what was that aircraft? What type was it? And what was its serial number, please? Now, if you know the answer to that question or can find it, can you please let Peter know? Although Peter has had this presentation for a week now, and I would not be surprised if he already knows the answer. You don't know the answer. You've done some searching. Oh, good. So I've actually got the great Peter done for a week, still looking. Fabulous. That makes me feel an awful lot better. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity very much. Thank you.
I'm sure that some people might have some questions. And do we have any from the floor? If not, how about the people out there in Zoom land? Anybody got some questions that they would like to give? He certainly had an interesting flying career before the war started. I know another whole story there of his wartime career. Is there talking the
in the offing about his water? Oh, there's a lot more research to do about his wartime. Yeah. Yes, it's.
And then, for how long after World War II did he continue to fly?
Through to the early 80s, he was still flying.
Mm. Yep.
Ian, have you ever tried to read the complete air navigator?
No, but I've got a copy and I have quoted, well, the museum has got a copy and I've quoted from it in the book. But not being an aviator myself, let alone a navigator, I would not presume to make any sense of it head nor tail. I think I know which way to put it up.
Very esoteric.
You
didn't come away.
Don, you have read it, have you?
Yes, I've tried to read it. Yeah. And got a bone up on trigonometry and all that sort of thing. But yes, I'm sure that it contains a lot of information that it would be nice to know. Not essential for everyday living.
Very good question. Janice Anderson back here in Brisbane has got a question. Janice?
That was very interesting, Ian. There's a plaque to Don Bennett up at Toowoomba Airport.
There is.
Because he was born in Toowoomba.
He was.
Now, are there any plaques or anything for him in Brisbane?
No. No, but the museum is the repository of the largest collection of Don Bennett material on the planet. And we have the Don Bennett office and we have a few displays of his material. Over time, we hope to do better with that as we get a better understanding through my work of the material that's in the collection.
Yes, Daryl.
Along those lines, was he associated at all with the museum? Did he
Oh,
agree
absolutely.
to be?
Yes, he
patron
was one of the patrons of the museum, as was Lee, his wife, after he died.
Yes, what's your question?
He went on to be in charge of choosing the pathfinders that were flying over Germany in the end.
Yes.
That's another story.
Yes, he went on, he returned to the RAF. He went from Imperial Airways to be one of the 5 who started up the Atlantic Ferry, which was the first to fly in winter the Hudson bombers and others, the Liberators, etc., across the North Atlantic in winter. And from there, he was brought back into the RAF. First at the number 1 Air Observer School at Eastbourne, and then he went off to 77 Squadron as commanding officer flying Whitleys, and from there he stayed on the base at Leeming but was posted as commanding officer number 10 Squadron. Was shot down trying to bomb the Tirpitz in Halifax's. And on his return from having been shot down, he got back from Sweden. Within about a month, he was appointed by Harris on the 5th of July as the air officer commanding of the Pathfinder Force. And John and I were just talking about that before John asked the question. He was when he took over in July or took up the command, he was appointed as went from wing commander to group captain. And then at the beginning of the following year, he was made an Air Commodore. And then when it took on group status, the Pathfinder Forces 8 Group, and then a year later, he was made an Air Vice Marshal at 33.
After he was shot down, it shows how important the British considered he was personally, because when he managed to evade capture and got across to Sweden, which was neutral, the British sent an aircraft to Sweden to bring him back to the UK. Then that wasn't done for many people.
I picked up my ears with Kisumu for Kenya because I've been to Kisumu, which was connected by train to the capital, which wouldn't have had a landing place for the flying boat. But could they make Alex Kisumu in one hop? They would have to have an intermediate stop, surely.
Oh, yes, there were many stops down. So they'd fly down the Nile. I'm trying to, I can't remember all the stops. I didn't list them mainly because I couldn't fit them on the slide, but there were about 4 or 5 stops to get through to Kisumu, which at that point was their hub on Lake Victoria.
The one aircraft that he owned, did he own many himself in that period of time, many others?
Well, unfortunately, with regard to the Hummingbird, as you could see, he could only fit one person in it. And when he actually fell in love with Lee and married Lee, he couldn't fit her in the plane, which was why when he first took her flying, he took her up in his mate Barry Littlejohn's Clem 32, which you would see in the list at the end there. Lee was very impressed, by the way, with his flying abilities, which was good. If you're going to demonstrate your ability to be a good husband, you need to demonstrate you can fly a plane well. And so he had to sell his beloved Hummingbird, although he made a £15 profit on it. But he didn't own an aircraft after that until after the war, so far as I know. During the war, they gave him a plane to fly around, which is a Percival Proctor.
Well, that has been a very enlightening story. Thank you, Ian.
My pleasure.
And at that point, we'll wind up if nobody else has got any further points. Yes, Darryl, something like that?
Did any of these planes end up in a museum anywhere, or do you know if this aircraft was flown by President Johnson type museum exhibits?
Not that I know of, but I can't speak with authority on that.
So
Ask me in 3 years.